Right. Good afternoon. My name is Stefan Moller, delighted to be moderating this session. Our discussion today will focus on how banks and other financial institutions detect and prevent global dirty money flows. We all know that criminals' technological expertise, coupled with the vast volume of transactions taking place and the global nature of corruption today, makes this an enormous challenge. We can combat this, though, through a combination of three things: effective collaboration between actors, effective policy related to money laundering in particular, and effective data and technology solutions. Our three panel members today, very handily, have expertise across all of these three areas. I'll briefly introduce them before proceeding with questions and discussion following that. First up, welcome Greta Barkaskiene, who is a financial crimes expert at the esteemed Lithuanian AML Center of Excellence. In this role, she started following a decade in law enforcement, much of it which was focused on financial crimes. We all know about Lithuania's excellent track record in this area, so delighted to have you. Next up, Ingrid Frustrate, Executive Vice President, Data and AI, and General Manager EMEA at Dow Jones. And also here as a representative of DT4C, which is an alliance of the leading technology and data companies that provide the digital means to fight financial crimes. They collaborate with policymakers to really develop policy around money laundering in particular and counter-terrorist financing. Next up, Petras Gotautas, who is Director and Head of AML at Urbo Bank. He's been in the financial sector for 12 years, much of that spent on compliance, especially in the field of discussion for today. And last but certainly not least, Roland Papp, who is a Senior Policy Officer at Transparency International EU. He specializes in illicit financial flows, and he previously worked at the European Parliament on anti-corruption issues, and he's very much an expert on public policy around AML in particular. So an excellent panel that really reflects the three areas for discussion today. But let's start off with you, Greta. So obviously in your day-to-day work at the Lithuanian AML Center of Excellence, you work a lot on the issues that we're discussing today. So would you like to explain what your role entails?
Oh yeah, thank you for that question. I'm glad to tell you more about what we do in our daily life in this center. Well, AML Center is a rather young organization. We are 3 years old, but we are not a baby anymore. We are a toddler, and we are fighting financial crime. And in doing so, we are combining the efforts of the public and the private sectors. To do that efficiently, we organized 4 working groups. So we are having one group working with legislation issues. We have the other group working with IT. Tactical cooperation group that has 3 subgroups, fighting fraud, sanctions evasion, and money laundering. And finally, we have educational group that works towards certification, and I will be gladly telling you more about it if the conversation moves us to that direction. So these groups are working in combination towards helping the ML community in Lithuania to enhance their knowledge and enhance their expertise by providing that platform to talk to each other, to share their pain points, to identify the problems and find the solutions. So if we are noticing something that is causing us pain in tactical cooperation group, talking about sanctions or AML, we move it towards another group, and that's how information sharing project was born. That's how we create new educational programs. And in general sense, we are strengthening the community in Lithuania towards excellence and professionalism in the field.
Ingrid, over to you. How do data and technology companies such as Dow Jones and the other members of DT4C support banks and other financial institutions in their fight against dirty money?
Yeah, and we did it in many different ways. I think to understand how this all came about, I'm taking you back to the 90s, to Nigeria, Sani Abacha, who was involved in corruption. And suddenly there was a huge interest from the banks, but also from regulators, to better understand politicians, and then more explicitly senior politicians. So a new term was born, politically exposed people, or PEPs. And what we were finding, or what the financial institutions, and at that point it was really only the banks, were finding that there was no set list. So there was no place where you could go and say, give me a list of PEPs from all over the world. That was also not their expertise. Doing research, building lists is not necessarily what their main activity is. So what they did, they came to information providers like Dow Jones or like other members of the DT4C Alliance and asked for help and said, can you help us build this list of PEPs? Which is what we did. But again, back at that time, there was no set definition even of what a PEP was. So we worked very closely with the banks to come up with a definition. Lots of discussions, is this type of role included, excluded, and then started developing that list. Once that was done, then there were questions from banks. Can you now help with this type of information? Can you help with that information? And where we are right now is that almost all of the information that is structured, because that's one of the requirements, it's very structured, that banks use, whether it's for KYC, whether it's for onboarding, whether it's for transaction screening, payment screening, comes through one of the information providers, because that's where our specialty is, and then the banks can do with the information what their specialty is.
That's a neat segue to you, Petras. You're obviously on the other side representing the banks. Could you explain how you at Obo Bankas detect and prevent dirty money flows?
Yeah, so our strategy is when we try to detect the dirty money flows and to get to know our customers, also mostly lean on these providers such as yourself. So I will run through a process and try to depict how we implement those measures. So first of all, it is a QAC information. When we onboard the customer, we try to collect as much information as possible, and there we use those lists and technologies to determine whether a customer has some adverse media or is, for example, a PEP, which is very important for corruption prevention. So once we do that, we then, I think the next stage is very important to the correct input of data into our systems is very important, because if data is insufficient or inputted incorrectly, then the systems will never work. So next step is input of information, and then it is risk assessments. We also use automated tools for risk assessment. We use that information that has been inputted into our systems. We determine risk profiles, and then it's the last stage. It is ongoing monitoring, where we also use another system. So all the strategy is based on IT systems. Once we determine some possible suspicious transactions or dirty money flows, we conduct investigations, and probably only there. This is a place where our experts do the manual work. So probably automated systems is one of the most important aspects of our strategy. I would say it like that. Thank you.
Roland, over to you. So we've touched upon obviously two of the cornerstones, which is clearly knowledge sharing, collaboration, the data and the technology and how that's implemented. But clearly the policy framework's absolutely essential in this area. What gaps do you see in the current global AML framework that you feel needs most urgent attention?
Thank you very much. And yes, I think it's very important that these wonderful people can only do their job properly if they have data what they can process and use and analyze and then decide what to do with that. And I think it's I would say that really it's far too easy still to hide the person behind the wealth and behind the companies. And we all heard about shell companies. And of course, it's very problematic when there is a shell company or there is a company, but there is someone nominee there, and we just don't know who the real person behind the wealth. Trusts are also a problem in many jurisdictions, and it's really hard to get any information on them. And there's one thing, these kind of entities, but then what is with the assets, what they own? And I think this is also a crucial point to see that many times this data is not even collected. There's not even a place to collect this data. Just to give one example, our colleagues in Transparency International France, together with the Anti-Corruption Data Collective, made an analysis in France where they matched the beneficial ownership data of the entities together with the real estate data, because in France it's available, publicly available, the corporate-owned real estate. And they found that 71% of the parcels which are corporate-owned in France, there is no person to attach to this. So they can still hide behind it, and there's no natural person connected to anything, which I would say is not even a loophole when we talk about this. This is really a systemic problem. And of course, when we talk about other assets, we can talk about the yachts and the sanctioned oligarchs' yachts, which is, we just don't know whose yacht that is. It sounds hilarious, but those are just still the tip of the iceberg. I mean, media love the yachts because they look good and interesting. But then when we talk about, for example, the financial sector and the different kind of alternative investment funds where we don't know the end investors, that's also really show systemic problems in our AML framework where financial secrecy is very much there.
Mm. Well, actually, can I stay with you, actually, Roland, just to, given that this is the tip of the iceberg, and obviously you represent a civil society organization, could you perhaps delve into a little bit more around what organizations such as your own and journalists even can do or how they can help in uncovering corruption and really supporting AML efforts?
I would put it in two different sides. I think one question is that, for example, journalists or civil society, they are not going to do the prevention work. Many times what we see that, for example, journalistic work, and they do amazing jobs, and people who were here throughout the week had amazing stories to hear and learn. They are usually uncovering something which is already done. And I think it's important that AML and your work is about the prevention and how to prevent that the dirty money gets into our financial system. Now, when it's too late, then unfortunately, sometimes civil society and journalists can uncover some stories, but then at the end of the day, it's still law enforcement who need to do their job. And then the criminal sanctions has to happen via those state authorities. And then, of course, civil society can help, and it's important. And throughout this week, again, I heard from authorities as well that they value very much the help of civil society. But again, they can only also do their part if they have access to this information, which is very much problematic. And it's another question. What if you want, I'm happy to dive in, like why it's even harder for civil society than from private sector to get this information and really do their job.
Greta, back to you. You mentioned before, obviously, the importance of knowledge sharing, the importance of collaboration between public and private entities, and that's a big focus of your work, really. How do you make it work?
That's a good question, actually. As I mentioned before, the center is rather young, so but we pride ourselves in being successful. So there are several key components in successful work. So first of all, we have to have that shared will to act. So at the center, we are providing the platform for both sectors to share their knowledge, share their problems, and look for the common ground and the solutions. So as long as those two sectors share that will to talk to each other, we might be successful. The second component is to be organized and to plan your activities. As I mentioned before, we have several different working groups, and that is for a reason. Because if we are tackling one problem at a time and focusing on that problem, we can move it further and to reach successful outcomes. And that's how we, as a jurisdiction, moved towards better sharing of information. And I'm talking about the Lithuanian legislative initiative to start information sharing between private to private entities. The project is still in the process, and we are taking the leadership in this, but the humble beginnings started at the center as the platform for this. And I think if we share that willingness to act and to talk to each other and to keep on moving forward, this is the key to success. We have to be united, we have to stay strong together, and we have to look for the solutions together, public and private sectors.
And Ingrid, over to you. You talked very eloquently before about the sort of the genesis of what you do. Perhaps focusing a little bit more on the present, can you give us some examples of some of the innovative data-driven solutions that your organization and others use to identify risk patterns?
Yeah, and I think the data very often is the solution, and I was going to talk about a few examples, and it is mostly in cases where obliged entities, so those entities that have to follow AML regulation, or whether it's anti-bribery and anti-corruption regulation, come to us and they can't solve the problem on their own. So one of them was a while ago, so going back to the mid-2000s, when the Siemens scandal broke, suddenly and explicitly from banks in the US, they were focused on the FCPA. Didn't matter that the law had existed for decades. Suddenly there was this focus on how can we actually make sure that we are compliant with the FCPA. And part of what was mentioned, or what is still mentioned in the FCPA, is you have to identify public figures, so people who work, who have a public function. And when you work for a ministry, that's very easy to identify. But what if you work for a state-owned company, a state-owned enterprise? That is much harder to identify. So initially they came to us. This was a group of large financial institutions in the US asking, can you help identify all employees for all state-owned companies in the world? And we're like, yeah, no, we can't do that. But how about if we actually identify the state-owned companies in the world? Because then by default, you know that if you deal with someone who works for one of those companies, they are actually considered to be a public figure. So that's what we did. And again, we worked with them to make sure that we covered what they needed, that we had all the data elements that we needed. Another example, which is more recent, going back to 2004, well, it sounds recent, it's not actually 10 years ago, when Russia invaded Crimea. Suddenly there was a lot of attention on the OFAC 50% rule, so the indirect sanctions. And again, the regulators make it very easy to identify what entities, subjects have been sanctioned. What they don't make it easy is to then actually identify those entities that are owned or controlled by sanctioned subjects. And according to the 50% rule, you need to treat them as if they were sanctioned in most of the instances. So again, we thought about how we could do that and delivered that solution to financial institutions. And then the most recent one, which is much more of a technology-driven solution, there is more and more interest, both from obliged entities as well as from the regulator, to identify adverse media or negative news. And that is an impossible task for anyone because there's just so much news out there. How do you know what news to trust, what news not to trust? But also, if as a bank you have millions of customers, how do you actually manage that information? So through a news aggregation, for many years, Dow Jones had a news aggregation product, and we've actually matched that with AI-driven solutions. So now suddenly it becomes much easier to say, here's my list of clients, just automatically monitor against this set of news sources that have been vetted by us, so we know we can trust them, and also only focus on these specific topics. So you're ignoring everything that isn't really related to financial crime.
Petra, that feels like a natural segue to you. Ingrid's spoken about some of the challenges in doing what we do. So my question to you is, what are some of the biggest challenges you faced in identifying suspicious transactions, given the challenges Ingrid spoke about and given simply the vast volume of transactions out there?
So I suppose the question itself shows the biggest challenge is to distinguish these suspicious transactions from all the transactions. So how we do it, so the transaction has two parts. So it is our customer that performs the transaction and the other party, receiving or sending party. We use these data sources, our vendors and automatic IT systems to screen our customers, to screen beneficiaries or senders of funds. There we find or do not find information, positive or negative information about the customers, and in our relations to sanctioned or other entities, people. So in this case, we find red flags whether our customer or beneficiary or sender of money is possible money launderer or other criminal. Other part of the distinct transactions is to know a customer, to know what to expect from a customer, and to distinct deviations from his usual or expected behavior. So for this, we use our type of monitoring systems, where we have some patterns, typologies onboarded, and we screen the unusual activities. So the customer, for example, may be a shell company or working on behalf of, for example, sanctioned person, which would not be disclosed by screening software, but we would not notice some unusual activities, and we would ask for more information, documents, and would investigate such behavior, and of course report it to our FIU. So these are main two fields on how we cope with those challenges to distinguish those suspicious transactions.
Roland, back to you. You obviously mentioned, you said before how essential it is that the policy framework that's in place makes all of this work. So looking at that, looking at the policy framework and how policy makers and banks and financial institutions work together, what's your assessment of how they collaborate at present and how they could collaborate more effectively?
Thank you. I think it's a very important question, and I see good trends, and well, Greta being a good example, and Lithuania, how they really start to do this work more and more. But I want to have a step back, because I think it's important to see that different actors and stakeholders have very different roles. So as I mentioned, obliged entities, they are the gatekeepers. Unfortunately, some of them are being there as enablers of financial crime, but most of them doing their honest job. And then authorities also have their different roles and different responsibilities. Then the question is, of course, of like what kind of capacities they have, and what we see is that both many times with obliged entities, their, let's say, their risk appetite doesn't match with the capacity what they have. At the same time, authorities, I can say fairly surely that most countries in the world do not have enough capacity to fight financial crime, and it's often not a priority. So, you know, with those two different sectors which all have their problems and their needs, and of course, financial pressure on private sector, and all the lack of political will in the public sector, they don't have an easy job to do. But at least I think it's once they can do things, and once they can have access to data, what they need to, I think there are like good ways forward now. Exactly, public-private partnership, what Greta knows better. And I would say that, for example, now in the European Union, there was now a long reform, to create a new anti-money laundering package. And I really see that there are some good opportunities which in the future can lead to a better way of this collaboration. There will be a new anti-money laundering authority in the EU, which is now being set up, and in a few years it's going to function. They will also have a very important role in this coordinating, collecting and gathering data, and help to work together with all the authorities and private sector as well. And also a new legally sound framework is created for partnership for information sharing, where obliged entities together, if they want, with law enforcement and supervisory authorities, they can share their information, what they gather. Of course, there must be and there will be specific data protection rules, and we all understand that privacy matters, and it's not about sharing everything with everyone. But I think there are these steps forward which really shows that it can only function if there is collaboration. And many times, the different institutions just see one or two data points, like one name, one address, one something, but it only can be clear that it's a problem when you see it in a bigger picture. Like one address is just an address, but if the same address has 5,000 companies registered to that, that's the problem and that's the red flag. But you only know it if you can look into the address book and see like what's there. And unfortunately, that's right now not always the case.
Roland, you talked about the future from a somewhat positive perspective in some respects, but obviously a number of challenges. I'd like to go to you, actually, Ingrid, to talk a little bit about the future. So not from a policy perspective necessarily, but more from future trends in the use of data and technology for AML efforts and beyond. What's in your crystal ball?
I'm not sure what's in my crystal ball. What I do know is if I think about the things that keep me up at night, is access to data. Because access to data is key. Roland talked about knowing that there's 5,000 companies registered at one address. On the positive side, technology has made it much, much easier, right? Because it's much easier to go through vast amounts of data and actually identify those type of issues. But the data needs to be available and the data needs to be accessible. And I think what we've seen, and there's many different reasons why data is becoming less accessible. In some instances, thinking about countries such as China, such as Russia, it's the government that makes it harder to access the data. The specific rules of how you can access the data, they have specific reasons for doing that. But at the same time, from a financial crime prevention perspective, having access to that type of data is extremely important, right? So how do you actually ensure that you continue to have access to data about Russian companies? How do you understand who is sanctioned by the EU, by the US, by the UK, in Russia, and what their ownership is? What is it that they own? You can only do that if you have access to data. So in some instances, I would say access is made more challenging because of government geopolitical issues, I would frame it. In other instances, which is what we've seen in the EU, and it's this tension that sometimes exists between privacy and transparency, and Roland, you mentioned this as well, right? There's a constant tension. So at what point is making data available too much information or too much data? And at what point is it actually really helpful? So within the EU, there was a judgment back in 23 that actually judged that when it came to beneficial ownership registers, that they should no longer be accessible to everybody because that was a violation when it came to privacy rights. Through the alliance that you mentioned earlier, and throughout the industry, I would say, there's been a lot of work done to reverse that. So the new AML package actually has specific guidelines about who can access what. But the EU is not the only place why we where we are seeing that if you think about the US and FinCEN took a step whereby they actually decided to make beneficial owner to create a BO register, which is amazing, but then they actually limited the access so much that it doesn't really matter that the register exists, right? So sometimes it's geopolitical, sometimes it's the tension between data privacy, and without data, without having access to the data, it becomes much, much harder to investigate anything.
Greta, on to you. So how do you stay ahead of challenges such as access to data or simply just the evolving financial crime tactics that you face? How do you ensure continuous improvement in the way that you work?
That comes from various areas of our activities. So, well, I've told you all about how active we are nationally, but we also participate in many formats internationally. So we are participating in Europol's EFIP, which is also public-private partnership. So we try to engage ourselves in many different formats to be everywhere, eyes and ears, to see what's happening around the globe, because it's very important to know that the Lithuanian financial sector is no longer serving only Lithuanian customers. So we have many different market participants, and everyone is seeing different things. So coming back to our national platforms, when we have different participants from the market and from the public sector sitting at that round table talking about what they see firsthand, it's also sharing that different level of knowledge, sharing what we know and what we do not know yet, what we need to look into. So that gives us the insight and that roadmap where we must go and what things we need to uncover, where we need to develop not only the skill of the whole market, but the center's experts as well. So we have double obligation, not only to share the knowledge and educate the market participants and the whole society, but also to develop our skill ourselves. So by indulging in those many different activities, participating in international formats, hearing out what different entities have to say and the experts have to say, we collect that knowledge and we make sure that that knowledge is spread amongst the AML professionals in Lithuania and our partners, that we would have at least same idea where we are and where we need to go.
Petras, I'll move on to you actually, because I think there's, I mean, you're both based here, and there's a lot of the work obviously that Greta talks about you're involved in as well. Could you specify how the private sector and banks such as yours benefits from public-private partnerships in the field of AML, such as those that Greta spoke of?
So yes, participating in an AML center is a great platform that helps communicate private and public sector. This financial sector is highly regulated sector, and this communication closes the gap of expectations of supervisory authorities and abilities of private sector. And another thing is we receive this perception view of AML center to what kind of level our compliance should increase. We set a benchmark and we have the same goals, and we very thoroughly try to achieve it. So it is very constructive and very beneficial to a private sector. To be more precise, what precise benefits we have received recently by participating in work groups. So it is certification. All our employees went through the certification programs, which resulted in a much better performance at work. Another is sharing information, especially when the war broke out. There were sanctions coming one after another. It was quite difficult to implement them quickly. So the AML Center joined public-private sector. We have joined into work groups where market participants shared their views on the sanctions, how to implement it, and we have established common rules and guidelines how we will do it. So it was also very beneficial. Of course, information sharing, this is still a project, but I believe once the project will be finalized, we will have a product that all the market will be very pleased to be using. So these are, I would say, main 3 things that we already took from AML Center. So these work groups, knowledge and certification, and very concrete, precise products that we are establishing in order to manage risk, because risk management is information and data management.
I'd like to finish off this this round of questions before we open up with you, Roland, actually, and perhaps a very tangible example on an instance where Transparency International EU's work really led to significant improvements in AML policy.
I would go back to the ECJ ruling, which was mentioned, and how much, so yes, as it was mentioned, that it shut down the public access based on privacy concerns, but I must say, I believe that when someone is founding a company and wants to do business with that company, that's basically the opposite of anything what is your private life. So, you know, for us, for Transparency International, this is very much also like a philosophical question of what exactly do you do with your company? And we believe that if you want a company, you should do it and go for it. But then there should be some kind of requirements what you do in order that the state and, you know, society is establishing a rule and helping you out. And that's kind of low bar to say that, to know who that person is, who is in this business. So I think it would be very important on a long term to really go back to public beneficial ownership information. But in this case with the ECJ ruling, now you mentioned it more from your perspective. For us, NGOs and civil society and more general and journalists, this court ruling also said that they do have a legitimate interest to get this information because they are part of this work to fight money laundering. And that is why they should get access. Now, it wasn't clear what it means. What is a legitimate interest exactly, and how and who should get this access? Now, it was a really bad ruling. As I mentioned, I think it's a bit of misunderstanding of privacy, but at the same time, kind of luckily, it was in the time when the EU was anyway doing its big AML reform I already mentioned. That is why the new upcoming 6th AML directive had to include something about this, of like exactly the access of beneficial ownership register, to the national registers, to private sector, to authorities, and to civil society and anyone else who has legitimate interest. And I think it was a good success that at the end of it, we managed to make sure that there is a clear way how this function is basically, there's a rather open way to interpret it, but the idea is behind that when someone is registering as an NGO or a journalist, their task is to prove that they are a journalist and an NGO, and not necessarily asking questions about a specific entity, because again, that can be very problematic and hard if it would be about case-by-case basis requests. And we know that because it already happened for years, for many countries, with Germany, with Cyprus. It many times was just denied, and it's really unclear, and there's a lot of room for individual decision from the registers, and room for discretion of like who gets what information if it's on a case-by-case basis. That is why, for us, it was very important to make sure that journalists, NGOs can have this access, and then they just need to register once with the entity. Of course, devil will be in the details and see how it goes, because unfortunately, it might be problematic and hard for people, especially from foreign countries, to register and to get that access. And we are unsure. And it seems also that, for example, the search functions might not be that good for the beneficial ownership registers on this access. And I think it's also quite problematic because many of this data, many of this work is possible if you have access, if you have money, to say so, and you can get access to any other services, whereas you are a journalist and want to consult, that's a different question. And unfortunately, it seems that most likely those BO registers in those countries where it was public within the EU, they might shut down at some point. We are still trying to understand, and I will try to stay positive here, even though I'm from Eastern Europe, so it's hard. But really to say that like we really want to really on the long term want to go back to public beneficial ownership data, because it's really more than just fighting money laundering. There's much more on that. Also when you fight environmental crime, organized crime, but also local corruption and many, many other problems, or media freedom, because it's you talk about media ownership, you need to know the BO of those outlets, and so on and so forth. So beneficial ownership is much broader and bigger than just preventing money laundering.
Thank you. And thanks to all the panelists. I think we can close off the first section of this. I'd like to open up to questions. Does anyone from the audience have any questions? If so, if you could mention who you are and who you work for in the name of transparency, that'd be great. Anyone? There we go.
Oh, good afternoon. Thank you very much. It's been very insightful. And my name is Rafael. I work with TIEU. And I'm actually in charge of the data-driven advocacy. And I just wanted to ask a little bit and to tease out if you could explain how AI comes into this discussion and this debate, because you've kind of alluded to it, but I don't think you've properly explained. So is it something that you're already using it? What were the obstacles of using it? Or is it something that you look forward to using it, and what is basically more or less your plan? And that's for any panelists.
I'm happy to start off. What I think is interesting is that there's now so much talk about AI, and we can all argue about what the exact definition is. Any form of AI was already there 20 years ago, right? So from that perspective, we were using it back then in a more rudimentary form, whether it was through natural language processing or machine learning. And the way that we look at AI and still look at AI, whether it's traditional AI, whether it's generative AI, is you always have to think about what is it that the machine can do really well, and what is it that a human can do really well, and then make sure that you have the right balance between the two. At Dow Jones, we call that authentic intelligence, and it really is. It starts by thinking about the sources, right? Because no matter what your technology can do, if you have sources that you can't rely on, sources or data that you cannot trust, then the technology might be amazing and it doesn't really matter. And we've seen that in some of the startup companies who have amazing technology, and then when you dig into the data that they are using, you're like, yeah, let's try that again. So the human, you still need the human expertise, you need the human intelligence to decide what is the data that I can trust, what is the data that I need to throw out. If it is analyzing vast amounts of data, then the machine can do that much better, much faster than a human. Within Dow Jones, we process around 600,000 news articles a day. There's no way that we could have an army of people reading through all of those news articles day by day. So that is something that actually works really well when it comes to AI, and you have AI doing that. When it then comes to actually deciding how AI does that, then again, you need the human expertise, because we talked about financial crime, we talked about corruption. Petra said a lot of examples of what is a suspicious activity. In order to make sure that your AI, whatever you're using, understands that, you have to have technology sitting next to a human to teach it. Once you teach it, then it can do its job. And then when it comes to risk assessment, you still need to delegate the ultimate decision to a human as well. So for us, we've been using it for many, many years. What is nice about now, it's much more readily available, so it's much easier to implement. It can deal with larger volumes of data, and it's much cheaper as well. So that is one of the reasons why it's so much more accessible. But it's a combination between the human and the machine.
Yes.
I wanted maybe to contribute a bit to this using of AI. So I agree completely that first of all you have to know yourself to be able to purchase or install the necessary and applicable system to your entities, risk levels and etc. And what practical use of AI I see. We as financial institutions are obligated to review our systems. So I believe this AI can do a better job in reviewing and testing our systems, back testing, and then adjusting them. So the person may receive the results of testing and then decide whether they are applicable or not, but these systems will do a much better, much faster work for back testing the systems, which is we are obligated to do by regulatory authority.
Go ahead.
Okay. Hi. My name is Angie Shlila. I'm a youth advocate from Lebanon. This does remind me of the question of banking in Lebanon. There's practically no division between the private and public sector when it comes to business, and that includes the banking sector. So obviously you have a lot of heads of state who are major shareholders in all of the major banks, and if they're not, then it's their cousin or their brother or their neighbor or their childhood best friends, obviously the answer to that firsthand is to just keep doing what we do in anti-corruption in general, accountability mechanisms and such. But if you want to take it from a different side, which is on a more, I don't want to say behavioral, but on a more compliance basis, what would be your recommendations for a better regulatory framework for banking to take into account these kinds of conflicts of interest in a way that focuses on, honestly, just like maybe day-to-day or even reporting stuff in general? Are there certain laws that you feel are necessary to be in place? Are there international mechanisms that you feel would be beneficial in this kind of situation? Thank you.
Roland, does this sound like one for you?
Oh, yes. It's a very interesting question. And I think it's very important to know that there is, of course, a difference when there's something looks good on paper, and there are like, good laws and everything is nice, but then how the rules are actually enforced, how they are followed up. Now I would again maybe take out that cases when, for example, you have state capture, because I think it's a very different problematic situation when you have really the system is built up in a way that is inherently, the authorities are not there to do their jobs, and I think that's a huge problem. And we also seen a couple of times also when, for example, this was used in a number of different ways. Like, and I'm coming from Hungary, and yeah, it's and I'm not using it because I'm Hungarian, but because it's a really bad example also of like how there you see that all the Hungarian National Bank and the head of it is and his family members and friends are owning private financial sector institutions and so on and so forth, who should be supervising it. Or also, like, actually the other case was Portugal, when the Angolan dictator's daughter bought a bank, and once you are a PEP, you own your own bank. You don't care that whether the rules around PEPs are actually enforced or not. But again, I mean, I'm not saying Portugal is a state capture, but I just also like when the state institutions also are there. And I think I would say that to find a solution, there are two different things. One is also the regulatory, and another is really a criminal. And I think it's very important to know that the regulatory to really have supervision in place. Supervisors need to have capacity. They need to do their job properly, and also when there are some problems, address those problems, and have those kind of penalties which have a deterrence effect. Because when we see that major global banks are fined by national authorities that they don't follow AML procedures, and the amount of fine is basically a rounding error in their accounting system, they're not really pushed or not very forced to change their practices. You're nodding, so maybe tell me if it's different. And that's one way. And so I think regulatory thing is one point. Another is with the criminal sanctions, and go after really, of course, the people, for example, the organized criminal and so on, and corrupt individuals, but also those who really helped to make it happen in financial institutions, in other non-financial obliged entities, lawyers, notaries, real estate agents. And really, I believe that also needs to be taken into account when we are trying to find solutions for these problems.
I think there was one other question. Yes.
Hi, I'm Irene Tello Arista. I'm from Action for Justice and a researcher at Central European University. I'm actually analyzing how to use beneficial ownership data for anti-corruption purposes. And what I'm seeing now that we're trying to match beneficial ownership data sets from 6 European countries to public procurement data sets is the low quality of the data in beneficial ownership registers. So I wanted to ask you if you have thought about this, because I'm also seeing that for bank systems, you have your own systems where you rely more on Orbis database, which is extremely expensive for us academics to actually access. So I think we're creating two worlds of people that have access to the Orbis database and us that have access to very low quality beneficial ownership data sets. And how can we actually make it that beneficial ownership data sets have now the quality that we require, when I think one of the key pieces was having it transparent and open to the public, and now that it's being backed, I know that the new AML directive is going on, but I think this was a huge backlash. And also we're seeing that now ownership complexity is increasing. Like, I think this is also a way that corruption networks are adapting their behaviors to make it a more harder. So if you can say something about it, because I'm trying to research this, but I think it's a very complex topic, and I would love to know what's your take on it.
I think all of us have something to say about it, so I'm happy to start. First, just addressing the complexity. Absolutely. Back in 2014, we still do, but back in 2014, we started doing a lot of research into Russian ownership. And what was amazing is that as soon as you had identified, so there was the EU or the US sanctioned someone, one of the Russian oligarchs, you mapped out all of their ownership, and you could do that because you could do that through corporate registers in Russia, combining that with media. And you would map it out, and you said, okay, all of these entities are 50% or more owned by whoever the oligarch was. The next day, then the EU or the US would sanction them, and bam, ownership changed. So now you had to start all over again, right? So it was this game of cat and mouse that they were playing. So absolutely agree with your comment about how complex it has become. What I do think, though, is that ultimately, the official data is the best data you can get, right? And I'm saying this even though I'm a commercial data provider, but ultimately the source of truth lies in what is being registered through a corporate registry, right? And one of the things that we noticed after the European Court's judgment was, yes, the beneficial ownerships in certain countries closed down, but the corporate registers did not. So what we are very often do, yes, it hurt us, but at the same time, you could still go to the corporate registers. You then just have to do much more investigative work to get to the ultimate beneficial owner, but you can get there. It's just more complicated, and the beneficial ownership registers actually provide easier access to it. So I would argue I would rely on public data much more than on private data, from my point of view.
We have also noticed some, of course, yes, public data is a primary source, and it should always be the one to look at, but we have, while investigating our own customers, the changes of ownerships, noticed some fictitious changes, for example, on selling of entity to a previous manager or some employee for a nominal price, which is significantly lower than actual price. Then through a business relationship with, for example, new partners, say supplier, they still route the funds to the same ultimate beneficial owner. So in a public registry, you will see one information, while actual information will be the other. So the quality of public information would be higher if there was also a historical information, I believe. But now I don't think we have it. We usually lose the information, so it depends when you look at it. So that's also.
Can I jump in? Absolutely right, and absolutely, I really see this problem, both the quality of data and also what you talked about, and I also mentioned that really this gap of like who has access to what, even if the information is there. I think one point is that to make sure that the data is correct is twofold. One is really to make the people who need to report, make them, like force them to report, and if they're not reporting, there should be consequences. Now I believe in France, also the same report I mentioned already earlier, they said that I think, I don't remember the exact number, but maybe around 1/3 or a bit less than 1/3 of the legal entities haven't declared their BO, even though in France it was already since 2017, if I'm not mistaken, the obligation to report that. And I think it was one single case when there was any kind of penalties against a French entity based on that they didn't report it. Now, of course, I believe that most French companies want to do it. I believe that the majority of those who didn't report might not have done it because they are like really bad actors. They just didn't do it for whatever reason. But then really make them forks. Interestingly enough, in many countries, the registers don't have the power really to force anyone. So for example, there was a famous case in the UK, I mean now it's actually getting fixed, that journalists registered a company with the name of Mickey Mouse, that the beneficial owner is Mickey Mouse, the other one was like with Adolf Hitler. And the register, even if they noticed that, they didn't have the legal power to do anything about it. Same case in Hungary, actually. They say of like, well, whatever. In Hungary, it's actually the financial institutions who have to put the data of all type of companies, and they say like, whatever the financial institution does, we cannot do anything. That's their data. Interestingly enough, for example, in Slovakia, where there was a open beneficial ownership registry rather early on, there was a lot of discrepancy reporting, and most of it was from public. And so that's, again, one more point of like really to see that there is some kind of discrepancy, then how to find it and how to report it. And I think the easy way is really at first time some kind of verification when the data is getting into the register. And we don't need to think about some rocket science. I believe in Denmark was that who first implemented the way that if the address are matched with the national address database, and if, for example, the data is, or the address is not a Danish data, then they just sent a letter, and if the letter came back, then yes, that's a verified address. And luckily, in the new AMLD6, there is this basic, some kind of verification has to happen with the beneficial ownership data to match with some kind of database. That's a basic requirement. Interestingly enough, or well, I've been in Brussels long enough, so I'm not surprised that member states were very much against this, that they said that's such a big administrative and technological problem to really make them communicate with, I don't know, with the tax authorities database to match the names with the numbers or addresses and so on and so forth. And I think that's really just a minimum to make sure that the quality is somewhat better than what we have now.
Thank you. It feels like a conversation, so I thought I'd ask again. How do you feel in general as organizations about collaborating with international or big companies, tech companies, to kind of maybe create a platform for that? I was having a discussion with somebody from Microsoft on the first day of the panel, and there was this idea of normalization of data, because sometimes they would be like in the registries for BOs, there would be somebody's names just like an N, and then there would be like NAD, and then we know that it's like Nadi, you know, and so it's like these it looks like three different people, and there was this discussion notion of training an AI to recognize these kinds of stuff. So it's just one idea, one way in which corruption happens and people avoid the traditional scanning of BO registries. But in general, it does seem like this technological issue that requires advanced technology. So how willing in a sense, because I know there's the issue of privacy especially. So how do you guys feel about approaching this topic in that regard? I mean, for me, it seems like there's no other way than to develop sophisticated technology with such companies.
Greta, do you want to take that from the perspective of multi-stakeholder collaboration?
I can try. Well, when we are setting standards for specific anything, basically, we have to, it's the demand who dictates what we want. And as long as we have the mutual understanding that we want to have the same standard, doesn't matter if we talk about this topic or another topic. We have similar questions in other areas, for example, like crypto tracing tools whatsoever. If we have enough stakeholders that are, the end users of the product that dictate that demand for a unified format, we're going to be successful because companies are there to provide that. So in terms of cooperation, I think the end user has to be very vocal of what they want. And if they want that and there's enough of stakeholders wanting that, I think it's possible and it's doable. And I think in the future it's going to happen.
And I think I would add to that, we had a conversation earlier today, not exactly about that topic, but it was more in relation to the EU and the new AML package, and whether or not all of the BO registers for each of the member countries would merge together, and so then you can do some of that technology work, or whether they would stay separate. And I don't know, Roland, whether you have a different view, but the way that we look at it, we think it's just staying separate. It's just like, here you can access them all, but it doesn't mean they are aggregating the data. And I think technology plays a huge role in that, but initially you can only do that if there is willingness from all the member states, in the case of the EU, to actually want that cooperation. And then you can start doing that.
I believe, yes, private sector would not only be a contributor to such initiatives, but also a beneficiary. So we would be more than happy to participate there.
Yeah, I will also jump on that. Yeah, interconnectedness, I think, it's a question, and if you're a user, you don't necessarily care whether this is interconnected or how it's interconnected. You want to make sure that, for example, the information you are seeking is the same and is available. It's not currently the case. And BO registry is one thing, real estate registry is another. It's a mess how in the EU, in like 21st century, richest countries in the world, and they don't have digital access to real estate data, and there is not a single access point, not even for authorities. So imagine how poor German law enforcement authorities need to scatter the data from different sources. It's hard to imagine why so, besides bureaucracies are slow and they not really want to change when they have to have these big changes. And it wants to just reflect on the willingness and the stakeholders really push. I think it's very important, and I believe that here in civil society, in larger civil society, can really push for more. Because many times we hear this, oh, just not possible, just not possible. Many times it is. And just to give still the example of David Sakonia, another wonderful expert academic from who was here, and he just told me this a couple of days ago in this conference that how is it that with healthcare data, which is really, really a lot of privacy issues, and of course, these are really personal, deep data, still it's happening that there are technological solutions where you aggregate all the data without the personal information, and you learn a lot of things from that. How is it possible that from financial data, we talk about privacy? And why? And well, obviously, because there are people who don't want this, but I really believe that we need to have this push and to have really the technological solutions to find that and really learn more of like what is going on in our world and what is happening with these trillions of dollars which are being laundered every year.
Unless there are further questions, I'll finish off with one last kind of big question, which I'd like each of you to reflect on. You've obviously talked a lot about the challenge of data. And that really, the quality of data and how that's used obviously seems like the biggest challenge in this endeavor. Roland, great statement you made before when you say you keep coming across people going, how do I make this possible? I mean, that is my question to you. How do we make the quality of data and accessing it more effective? Is it capacity? Is it political will? Is it the policy framework? Is it collaboration? Is it a mix of all of the above? But in 30 seconds from each of you, how do we fix this? Greta, starting with you.
Oh, it's nice to start. Actually, all of this conversation, I'm talking about the willingness, and I know that I am sometimes being overly positive, but I think that's the first step. If we want to move forward, we need to be, all of us, willing to make that step forward. So this is a big problem, and that we need to tackle, and it requires time. But when we are working together towards it, and we're making that push that I was talking about before, I think we are progressing somewhere. As long as we believe in what we do, and we are not losing our direction, we're going to be successful. So that's the first step to take.
Ingrid.
I was going to say all of the above because that was the easy answer, but then I was thinking, I was listening into the closing session like 2 hours ago, and one of the things that was stressed, if you think about the people that are involved in corruption versus those who want to fight it, we are extremely united, and I think ultimately that is how you move forward, by ensuring that we all fight for the same cause.
Petras.
So on an international level, I believe there should be some data quality standards, common standards. On a governmental side, from my perspective, we should not only be obligated to manage risks, but also to be able to use the tools, to access the information that is necessary to manage the risks. So from political side, there's access to information. And from the private sector part, we are all interested in cooperating and doing what is necessary to be done. So,
Roland, the final word is yours.
I would say that there are two different things. One is the means, and the other is the capacity. And so the means of really to make sure that there is data available, there is data which is quality data, people who need this data can access to have that, and the other is really the capacity. Both, as I mentioned, really like for private sector, they have the capacity to deal with the risk they are ready to take. Supervisors, law enforcement, civil society, and all these stakeholders would really have the capacity to put as much effort and resources in every sense into this problem as much as needed.
On that, I think we can conclude the panel, the session. Thank you so much to the panelists. Thank you very much to the audience.